Welcome, everyone, to this panel. My name is Susan Srigley, and I'll be moderating and trying to keep all of us, including myself, on time. I have one small announcement about the program, and that is for this afternoon session, panel 2, there has been a misprint, just so we're clear. Panel 2 is not O'Connor and violence, that has already happened. Panel 2 is the Milledgeville pilgrimage. So if you can just make a note of that in your, I don't know what that means, that the Milledgeville pilgrimage became O'Connor and violence, but we're talking about death, so who knows?
Yes, our apologies to the people.
Apologies to the folks on that panel for that. These things happen. So we are now at the infamous death panel, one you've all been waiting for. We should be waiting for. I'm going to introduce all of our speakers and the titles of their papers, and you can refer to the bios in the program to learn a little bit more about each of us. So first speaking will be Angela Alaimo O'Donnell, and I just want to say my personal thanks, because while Angela was thanking everyone last evening, no one had the opportunity to thank Angela for the enormous amount of work. Certainly the person who is at the institution that is hosting primarily the conference bears the burden of much of the work. And so she made a lot of things happen behind the scenes, and we're very grateful to her for bringing this conference together. So thank you, Angela. Angela's paper is entitled Sitting Down with Brother Death, Flannery's Juvenilia. I will be speaking next. My paper is titled You Can't Be Any Poorer Than Dead, Traveling Home in the Violent Buried Away and Judgment Day. And Shannon Skelton will be speaking about When Death is Out of Fashion, Flannery O'Connor and Zadie Smith on Being Pilgrims at Home. So I'm going to let Angela begin. We are going to save the Q&A till after all of the presentations. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Yes, the death panel. It's a well-known fact that O'Connor had a deep and a compulsive fascination with death. In her 31 stories and 2 completed novels, death is a familiar character and shows up on a regular basis in a variety of ways. Death stalks her characters in her signature stories, including A Good Man is Hard to Find, Greenleaf, A Stroke of Good Fortune, The Enduring Chill, The Comforts of Home, and The River, just to name a few. He shows up in Wise Blood at the end, and he appears at the very beginning in The Violent Bear It Away. He is present in early stories, such as Wildcat, wherein he's imaged as a mountain lion who is supposedly hunting down old Gabriel. And he makes a surprise appearance in O'Connor's very last story, Judgment Day, when old Tanner is killed by an angry Black man in New York City and then shipped back to his native Georgia for his burial. Death is a power and a presence in the lives of her characters, just as he is in our own. In addition, Death also asserts his dark presence by means of absence. In his biography of O'Connor, Brad Gooch writes that many critics have noted the dominant place of widows in her fiction, but it is rarely noted that, quote, every widow or orphan implies a missing husband or father. O'Connor's 2 novels and many of her stories are filled with the eraser marks of all these dead fathers. Indeed, the remarkable presence of this absence abounds. The life you save may be your own, A Temple of the Holy Ghost, The Artificial N-Word, Good Country People, The Enduring Chill, The Comforts of Home, and Everything That Rises Must Converge, among other stories, all feature fatherless children. This, of course, should not surprise us, given the fact that Flannery's loss of her own father, Edward O'Connor, on February 1st, 1941, when she was only 15 years old, was a watershed experience in her life. She writes in a notebook she kept during her first year of college, some 2 years after her father's death, quote, "The reality of death has come upon us, and a consciousness of the power of God has broken our complacency like a bullet in the side. A sense of the dramatic, of the tragic, of the infinite has descended upon us, filling us with grief, but even above grief, wonder. Our plans were so beautifully laid out, ready to be carried to action, but with magnificent certainty, God laid them aside and said, "You have forgotten mine." Like O'Connor's fatherless and newly motherless character Julian, at the end of Everything That Rises Must Converge, young Flannery finds herself being ushered into the world of guilt and sorrow, a dark place characterized by profound grief, but also, strangely, wonder. A brave new world has opened up for Flannery, and she knows she will need to figure out a way to navigate it. And one of those ways will prove to be writing fiction. Creating stories in which her characters are suddenly and shockingly confronted with death, whose struggles enable her to vicariously work out her relationship to her own cataclysmic loss. In my presentation today, I'd like to suggest that O'Connor actually started exploring this frightening terrain long before the death of her father, when she was still a child, and that she did it in a way that is entirely characteristic of the adult Flannery, through humor. I didn't mean to say humor and have a crucifix come up there at the same time, but it was destined to happen. The Christian comedy. Again, it should not surprise us that young Flannery would be fascinated by death. As a cradle Catholic myself, I can attest to the fact that Catholic children are taught to think about death early and often. Through the images that dominate our homes and our churches, the scripture readings heard in church and Catholic school, and even the holy sacrifice of the Mass, which enacts the story of Christ's death over and over and over again. Catholic churches and homes are filled with crucifixes, not decent, empty, abandoned crosses, but crosses to which a tortured man has been nailed and hangs from. Catholic families also keep rosaries in their homes, sacramental objects which feature a small crucifix and a string of beads that are fingered during the recitation of prayers focused on, among other events, the torture and the killing of Christ. Catholic children, who are often bored in church, spend hours upon hours pondering paintings, stained glass windows, and statuary depicting saints and martyrs, many of whom hold up the instruments of their execution and even the specific body parts that were subjected to torture. St. Lucy presents her gouged out eyes on a dish, St. Bartholomew holds up his flayed skin, and St. Agatha beholds her own chopped off breasts on a platter. Indeed, a Catholic upbringing is a bloody business, a reality O'Connor reminds us of in her story, A Temple of the Holy Ghost, in which the unnamed little Catholic girl in the story considers her potential occupations in life and decides, quote, she could never be a saint, but she thought she could be a martyr if they killed her quick. From her infancy onward, if you've ever seen that crib, you know what I'm talking about. From her infancy onward, Mary Flannery's life was super saturated with Catholicism and the inevitable presence of death. A few years ago, when I first visited the Flannery O'Connor childhood home in Savannah, as I'm sure many people in this room have, and if you haven't gone there yet, please run there as soon as you can, I was struck by the fact that little Flannery's crib was situated or is situated beneath a window which looks out across Lafayette Square at the spires of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. There's the window, and there's the church. St. John the Baptist, of course, was another saint martyred in a graphically bloody way. It's a wonder that beheadings don't figure more often in Flannery's stories, given the fact that this is the church she was baptized in and that she went to as a child. Baby Flannery would not only have seen the cathedral out her window, she would have heard the church bells calling people to funerals, to pray the Angelus, or to attend Mass. There was no escaping the looming presence of her family's faith. It fed her spiritual life and it shaped her imagination. Given all this, it makes perfect sense that in her earliest writings, we see evidence of O'Connor's fascination with death. In the collection of Flannery's juvenilia at the archives at Emory University, her drawings and poems demonstrate a precocious preoccupation with ultimate and theological issues, mortality, the Last Judgment, and the afterlife. At the same time, we also see her unrelenting sense of humor, even when dealing with serious concerns. Call it gallows humor, call it whistling in the dark, but whatever we call it, we recognize this blend as pure Flannery. As an example of this, I'd like to review the illustrations and the text she wrote for a birthday booklet she created for her father, offering sage advice on how to live a virtuous life. How to live to be 80 and still get to heaven. The title of the booklet young Flannery creates for her father is humorous and also poignant in retrospect, given the fact that Edward O'Connor would not make it to 80. In fact, he would die of lupus at the relatively early age of 45. Flannery could not possibly have known this, of course. But even so, her booklet, filled with clever phrasing, charming verses, and humorous illustrations, has a serious edge to it, acknowledging the inevitability of death at 80 or otherwise. The first poem of the book establishes this theme. If you want to live a life of righteousness and gain, just follow these directions here, and you will catch the heaven-bound train. The words heaven-bound train are written across the bottom of the page where she has drawn a train, smoke billowing out of the smokestack as it heads upwards towards heaven. The use of casual idiom and the homely trope of following a set of directions as a means of getting access to paradise for eternity, set beside elevated biblical language, righteousness and gain, foreshadows her fondness for the grotesque, an affection for the absurdly incongruous that will become a hallmark of Flannery's fiction. O'Connor's love of bringing together strange bedfellows started young. The subsequent page features the word avoid, written in large capital letters and emphasized by double lines around each letter. Surrounding this dramatic warning are smaller drawings, I hope you can see them, featuring a liquor bottle, a cigar or a cigarette, a bar of soap, and in small letters, again in all caps, the words, "Damn it." Also featured are two faces, each representing a devil or a demon, drawn above and below the word avoid. This page serves as a pictorial prelude to the poems that will follow and that are devoted to the transgressions represented here, liquor, tobacco, and cussing. Damn it. Again, we see O'Connor's characteristic humor in exaggerating these dangers and in comparing unlike things. The fact that the soap is included among the evil substances is because she dislikes her Saturday afternoon bath, and it's a hilarious vintage O'Connor moment. We also see her love of iconography in the illustrations, a technique she likely learned from those statues of martyred saints. She will use a similar technique in her story, Good Country People, when Manly Pointer pulls out of one of his hollow Bibles and opens it and sets forth a flask of liquor, a box of condoms, and a pack of pornographic playing cards for Holga's consideration. It's almost like an altar that he sets up and he puts the three idols out there. And the joke in the scene, and of course it is a joke, despite the seriousness of the sins that Manly is suggesting that they commit together, is entirely visual, as is the case with the page in her father's birthday booklet. The four poems that follow, one per page, are much like the one that begins the book in form, technique, and spirit. The verse consists of alternating 4 and 3 beat lines, mostly, whose second and fourth lines rhyme, a version of the ballad meter and the hymnal meter that, for example, Emily Dickinson used so well. Young Flannery uses the form to good comic effect. Often the rhyme is surprising or unexpected. This is a fun one. Liquor is a rotten drug, and those who drink it know that if this habit's once begun, you're sure to go below. Slide 4. Tobacco is a stupid plant, and those who chew it say that if this habit's once begun, you're sure to rue the day. Flannery's skill with meter and rhyme is perhaps best illustrated in the third poem dedicated to cussing. Cussing is a right bad habit, and those who do it tell that if the habit's once begun, you're headed straight for hell. The use of the colloquial cussin' instead of cussing begins the poem in a casual tone, as does the expression right bad habit, in contrast to the seriousness of the subject, salvation. And the suspension of the rhyme at the end, which the poet in her purity and virtue refuses to spell out, requires the reader to say, at least inwardly and perhaps aloud, the word hell in order to complete the poem. Thus, Flannery's father and we are led into temptation by the clever child who is ostensibly trying to teach us how to avoid this particular sin, but instead dragoons us into committing it. Page 6, some say, if you want to go to heaven and to choose the narrow path, that every sad day afternoon, you gotta take a bath. Personally, I think that's a lot of baloney. Young Flannery concludes, I'm sorry, that needs no explanation. Young Flannery concludes her birthday advice to her father as she would any prayer with a fervent amen, but then adds a PS, quote, "Oh, be kind to the little woman," who is presumably her mother, Regina. The idea of a small child referring to her adult-sized mother as the little woman is hilarious, even as Flannery exposes the absurdity of the image and the cliche. In addition, this sign-off lets us in on a little joke between Flannery and her father. As we know, Edward O'Connor was appreciative of his young daughter's wit and her odd sense of humor. He used to carry her drawings around and her verses in his wallet. He would show them to people. Her mother, however, was ambivalent. Regina was trying to mold Flannery into a polite young Southern lady, an identity that Flannery wanted no part of. Okay. Sorry, I somehow lost my page. I will find it in a second. Wanted no part of. My apologies. How did this happen? It must be 3 hours of sleep that did it. Okay, well, I will just pull up and finish. Sorry about that. My apologies. Okay. Okay, this should it. Nope. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that's hard. Oh. Yeah, almost there. Okay, yeah. So Flannery was, as we know, Regina was trying to mold her. Flannery was Edward's favorite child, and her father was her favorite parent. The PS at the end of the verses acknowledges their kinship, their collusion, and their shared resistance to the little woman who exercised such a large role in their lives. One has to acknowledge that this is a very unconventional birthday card for a 10-year-old to create for her father. There is nothing normal about this. No mention of the usual things that might please a child: birthday cake, ice cream, candles, presents, etc. Instead of celebrating her father's life in the here and now, young Flannery demonstrates her deep-seated fear of his premature death and concern for his immortal soul. Reading this card, one wonders whether she has reason to be concerned about her father. Though she was never told he was suffering from lupus, she may very well have sensed his weakened condition, and even at this early stage of the disease. As a child myself who grew up with a sick father, sick parent, who died when I was very young, I was 8 when he died, I know from experience that children can read subtle signs and sense the vulnerability of a sick parent. We instinctively know that our well-being and our own survival depends upon our parents' survival, and their vulnerability makes us vulnerable. Even young Flannery's comic concern for her mother at the end of the birthday booklet suggests a child who was afraid of utter abandonment. I remember after my father died, my deepest fear was that my mother would die too. This little birthday card gives us a glimpse into young Flannery's psyche and demonstrates that the adult O'Connor's theological and aesthetic disposition was evident in her even as a child. Her instinctive understanding that the universe, seen from a Judeo-Christian vantage point, and particularly a Catholic one, is a fearful place, but it's also essentially comic. Human history doesn't end with the tragedy of the crucifixion. Rather, it begins anew with the comedy of the resurrection. This viewpoint goes hand in hand with Flannery's love of the grotesque, the characteristic blending of the horrific and the hilarious in her stories, because at the end of the day, the Christian knows that all shall be well. Her sense of humor is a sign of her certainty. As O'Connor once stated, and she is often quoted on this, only if you are secure in your beliefs can you see the comical side of the universe. It's not a linguistic accident that the words human, humor, and humility all have the same root. They come from the Indo-European hume, spelled G-H-O-M, best translated by the English hummus or humus. Humus is a word that means soil or earth or dirt, reminding us of the creation of Adam in Genesis, of the fact that human beings are made of the stuff of earth. For dust we are, and to dust we shall return. The word human is derived from humus, returning us to the ground of our being etymologically, in much the same way death does physically. Thus, the very name used to describe man and womankind inevitably engenders in us humility. And for what fool would be proud and arrogant in the face of such a humble beginning and such a humble end? The word humor partakes of both our humanness and our humility, in that it thrives on the recognition of our flaws as fallen beings. Humility allows us to admit and embrace our radical imperfection, and humor lets us delight in it. Humor and the comic are signals of transcendence. As theologian Jürgen Moltmann writes, quote, "The laughter of the universe is God's delight. It is the universal Easter laughter. Humor, along with its attendant laughter, allows us to suspend the rules of the ordinary world as it takes us out of ourselves and our current situation, dire as it may be, and enables us to glimpse a consoling vision that delights. The humor may be momentary, but this other reality that the humor points to is not temporary at all. It in fact highlights a world beyond our current troubles that is essentially comic, a world in which all that is broken will be made whole again. This is the redeeming power of laughter, which makes suffering easier to bear, in part because Christians believe that the world is not final conclusion, to quote Emily Dickinson. In some sense, humor acknowledges a sacramental universe, a visible sign of the invisible reality of God's presence. In keeping with this generous theology, a theology O'Connor assents to, it might be argued that God gives human beings the gift of laughter that they might enjoy a foretaste of heaven. So I'd like to conclude my remarks on this most unconventional of writers, who writes the most unconventional of birthday cards, in an unconventional way, with a poem. Yesterday, I read a poem from my collection, Andalusian Hours. I wrote poems as a result of having spent so much time with O'Connor's voice in my head. I wanted to get it out onto the page. And so I enjoyed this sort of daily imaginative bibliomancy, dipping into her writings, using an epigraph, and then writing a poem from her vantage point and getting to see the world, if only for a few minutes a day, through her eyes. And looking back through those poems, I realized how many of them are focused on death, interestingly, both her own and the deaths of others. So I thought I'd close by reading a poem that focuses on her childhood, sisterhood with death. And this is also partly inspired by, again, one of my visits to the Flannery O'Connor childhood home. As you can see, that there are 2 single beds in Flannery's room, and supposedly one of those extra beds was kept around for a visiting cousin who might like to stay there. But it occurred to me that the bed might also be occupied by a kind of phantom sibling in Flannery's imagination, a sibling who might go by the nickname Brother Death. So the poem attempts to capture O'Connor's ambivalent relationship to death, a power and a personage that was both a friendly familiar and an avatar of all her fears, a consciousness of death as a dark double born in the same moment as she was, a twin who dogged her all her life. And the poem is called Flannery's Twin. And the epigraph comes from Conversations with Flannery O'Connor, where she says, "I'm a born Catholic, and death has always been brother to my imagination. I'd be an only child except for him, sleeping in my room with me at night, our twin beds side by side. When we toss the rock for hopscotch, he always rolls a 10. One-footed, I teeter and bend to snatch that stone and hops home safe and whole. Whatever game we've played, he's never lost. Quick at jacks, sharp at cards, fast and light on his feet when we skip rope. My role as his sister is to keep him amused, lest he should grow bored and try to leave. I tell him stories, make him believe he is invincible, when he is not. He's a fool, but he's the only brother I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Hello, everyone. As the person who has been exchanging emails with all of you since February, it's nice to finally be here with you in London. I gave a paper in Milledgeville in the fall that comes out of a new direction in my Flannery O'Connor research focusing on death. I'll spare you a reintroduction to that work for the sake of those in the room who were there in September and just give you a few highlights to introduce the topic for this paper. I've been teaching death, dying, and spirituality for over 20 years now, and for the same amount of time, I've been volunteering as an end-of-life companion or palliative care volunteer. It just strikes me now, listening to Angela talk about the loss of her father and thinking about the fact that this was also formative for Flannery O'Connor, that all of my death work began with the death of my father 25 years ago. While I've mostly read O'Connor's fiction through the lens of my primary academic discipline, which is religious studies, my work in death studies has created an opportunity to approach O'Connor's writing in new ways. More to the point, this focus on death awareness has led me to rethink how a reckoning with mortality might inform some of the spiritual insights of O'Connor's characters, especially given her experience of her father's death, her own virtual death sentence of lupus, and leading perhaps to the recently quoted and often quoted statement that death has always been brother to my imagination. At that Milledgeville conference, using a good man is hard to find as a launching point, I suggested that confronting mortality could have a revelatory force that I had previously argued only in relation to the violence in her stories. Obviously, they're not mutually exclusive, violence and facing death, but the subtle shift in emphasis I'm proposing is about a more primal or existential encounter where the grace afforded her characters comes cloaked in mystery, fraught with more questions than answers. So for instance, we could think of the line, "She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life," as an expression of the sheer power that death can wield to transform a life. Or how death held at the temple can provoke a kind of awe at this brief life and the desire to live truthfully and indeed better. To be clear, the misfit says she would have been a good woman had she lived with an awareness of her mortality, not smart or morbid or what people worry I might be with all this death talk depressing at parties, right? The proverbial gun at her head is a glimpse of what it means to live with our own ending in mind. It suggests that the power for human improvement and goodness can come with a more clear-sighted consciousness of our impending death. Ultimately, what I have begun to trace out in O'Connor's fiction is how an awareness of death is itself a reordering force on life. Today, I'd like to bring the conversation down just a little lower than the angels. And against O'Connor's advice in Mystery and Manners, I am actively on the lookout for the dead bodies. Caitlin Doty, mortician and founder of the Death Positive movement, identified a relatively recent yet critical change in our relationship with the dead, most notably the way in which we have outsourced care for the dead and dying to funeral homes, hospitals, and long-term care facilities. Only, say, 100 to 150 years ago, most families would have borne the responsibility of caring for their dead and dying loved ones, and much of this would have taken place in the home. The effects of this shift are being studied more systematically in the area of death studies, and it's clear that not only has this change in our relationship with the dead impacted the grieving process, it has distanced us from death, making death unfamiliar, and made us less accustomed to the pattern of its labors and associated rituals. In O'Connor's stories, we see characters who care about the dead bodies and characters who don't. I'm interested in exploring what the difference is and how one's relationship to the dead yields a deeper meaning into the spiritual significance of life. In O'Connor's essay, Novelist and Believer, we can infer from her comments that a burial, like a baptism, as well as the bodies involved, has a meaning that transcends the ritual acts involving water and dirt. On this point, she makes her intention with religious rituals clear, to make the reader feel in his bones, if nowhere else, that something is going on here that counts. On the earthbound and practical level, what we're talking about here is disposition, namely, what we do with the bodies of our dead and how we care for and remember them. And certainly for the Catholic before 1963, when the church lifted the ban on cremation as a form of disposition, though with the significant condition that the cremains are not scattered, divided, and kept in the home, the de facto form of disposition was burial. Pardon my Latin, in pium e constatem, on the pious and constant remembrance of July 5th, 1963, the then Holy Office established that, quote, all necessary measures must be taken to preserve the practice of reverently burying the faithfully departed. The inherent meaning in burying the dead is described thus, quote, in burying the bodies of the faithful, the church confirms her faith in the resurrection of the body and intends to show the great dignity of the human body as an integral part of the human person whose body forms part of their identity. This is at the forefront of Mason Tarwater's mind when he worries about Raber might do with his body after his death. He'd burn me. He'd be willing to pay the undertaker to burn me to be able to scatter my ashes. He don't believe in the resurrection. Pium e constatum also states that the church cannot condone, quote, erroneous ideas about death, including, and this is worth noting, I think, the idea that death is, quote, the definitive liberation from the prison of the body. The body matters. It is not a vessel, a prison, or a shell. Thomas Lynch, the poet undertaker, you heard that right, has famously said, when it comes to disposition, the dead don't care. My students are always rightly shocked by this statement when they read it, and we spend some time trying to get at what Lynch means by it. He's talking about ritual, how we honor the dead, and ultimately, how the care of the dead is ultimately left to the living. Lynch has since made a point of clarifying this oft misunderstood phrase by saying, what I've written is, well, the dead don't care, the dead matter. The dead matter to the living. And he also says, in accompanying the dead to where they need to go, we get where we need to be with the certain knowledge that life has changed. In other words, it's not a dismissal of the dead. His language is participatory, relational, reciprocal. Both the dead and the living must process the reality of death together. And you can't do that when the dead body disappears, sometimes never to be seen again, as can often be the case in modern death care. Lynch notes that we are in strange times when the presence of the dead at their own funerals has become optional. For Lynch, this is just another consequence of the slow erosion of embodied rituals around death, going so far to say that where death means nothing, life is meaningless. Mason Tarwater tells Francis, burying the dead might be the only honor you do yourself, emphasizing the implicit connection between the living and the dead, but also acknowledging the dignity and personhood of the dead, who are not just empty shells of bodies. What does the stranger tempt Francis into thinking? He dismisses the body with a dualism that negates the person that was Mason Tarwater. His soul is off this mortal earth now, and his body isn't going to feel the pinch of fire or anything else. For the stranger, the dead are the most impoverished, and their existence means nothing once they are dead. It's just a body with no life or history or connection to the living. The dead are poor. You can't be any poorer than dead. The dead have no rights, R-I-G-H-T-S, deserve no rights, R-I-T-E-S, and hence Mason will have to take what he gets. The traveling copper flue salesman Meeks measures human worth only in terms of his business model. Business improves when he asks after a customer's family, only appearing to care for the sake of the sale. But when they die, all pretense to remember the dead is abandoned. Thank God when they're dead, he says to Francis, that's one less to remember. For Meeks, like the stranger, there is no inherent value to Mason's body once it's dead. To return to Lynch, where death means nothing, life is meaningless. What does this imply? Well, I can only find more questions. If the dead body is emptied of value or worth, not worth our time, our attention, our love, not worth bathing and anointing, shrouding and vigiling, if the disappearance of the person who animated that body renders it inconsequential, a shell, dead matter, really then, what is a life with this erasure of death? Funeral directors, morticians, and crematory staff, including Lynch, who wrote an article titled Cremation, a Practice in Need of Ritual, have increasingly been imploring more people to be present at, in particular, cremations and partake in some kind of ritual for this form of disposition. Why? Because the morticians feel strange that they are the last ones seeing off this person with no family witnesses, making the whole thing feel oddly empty of meaning, without community, sent off by strangers, without ceremony. If the current purveyors of the dead, who are just doing their job, are at times the only ones honoring them, and they think it's weird, maybe we should be paying attention. And if the growing awareness of alternative modes of disposition, like natural organic reduction, aka human composting, alkaline hydrolysis, water cremation, currently only available in Canada, and natural burial is any indication, side note, all of these are deeply appealing to my students' concerns about the environmental impact of death, then maybe the dead do care, or at least they care about what happens to their bodies after death. Take T.C. Tanner, for instance. Is he just a cranky old man giving his daughter a hard time? Or is there a more powerful desire in him to return home, to a place he knows and where he is known and can be remembered when he dies and is put in the ground? Tanner is ahead of his time in completing his, quote, advanced directives, or what we call pre-organizing the details pertaining to our wishes after our death. His written out carefully by his shaky hand and pinned to the inside of his pocket. And why? Because as he directs Coleman, New York is no kind of place. Midway through the story Judgment Day, when Tanner is sitting at the window of his daughter's apartment, he recalls the moment when he was about to lose the place in Corinth he knew as home to Dr. Foley. While Dr. Foley is offering Tanner a job running the still on his newly claimed property, Tanner's gaze drove on past the farthest blue edge of the tree line into the pale afternoon sky. And then, in a remarkable moment of juxtaposition, O'Connor begins the next paragraph sentence with Tanner still in Corinth, looking across the field, only to finish the sentence with Tanner returned to the New York apartment feeling, quote, as if his spirit had been sucked out of him into the woods and nothing was left on the chair but a shell. The language here is compelling given the discussion so far of bodies, spirit, death, and meaning. Tanner's whole being longs to be home, both as a living man and a dead one, held together, one being, the same person, whose death does not empty him of meaning. Tanner is clear. Place matters for his death as much as his life, and the same dignity owed to the man in life is owed him in death. Tanner's daughter, however, does not think it matters. And unlike Buford Munson, she's one of O'Connor's characters who doesn't care about the dead. She'll bury him, despite his desire to return home, right here in New York. A New York burial is just as good as any other place. She won't be, quote, taking that trip down there again with any body. I mean, she did do every last living thing for him, didn't she? A dead body is just a dead body. Like Tanner, all Mason Tarwater asked was, when I die, get me in the ground where the dead belong and set up a cross over me to show I'm there. That's all in the world I'm asking you to do. In the end, Francis abandoned Mason's body like Tanner's daughter abandoned his. A dead body is just a dead body, as the stranger and Meeks would have it. But what was it that Thomas Lynch said about the relational action of caring for our dead? By accompanying the dead where they need to go, we get where we need to be. Tanner and Tanner's daughter does not accompany her dead, and she does not get where she needs to be. Instead, the lines in her face deepen as sleep eludes her nights, not until her father is returned to Corinth do her good looks mostly return. It's worth considering the consequences for the living when they fail to honor and remember the dead. That's us. Julia Samuel, a British grief psychotherapist, suggests that 15%, I imagine it's higher, of psychological disorders are the result of unresolved grief. In our death-denying culture, it's a statistic worth paying attention to. In fact, researchers have found that being in the presence of our dead, caring for them, physically being with their bodies, significantly ameliorates the grieving process. It's no wonder there is unresolved grief in a culture that assiduously keeps its distance from death, generally, and our dead particularly. If what Lynch says is true, then our relationship with the dead is just as important for us as it is for them. Thank you.